how many of you had a parent or parents who would wake you up loudly in the morning? I got like an immediate laughter out of that. So you have this image in your mind, right? I don't think I'm alone in this when I say that my dad would wake me up. I think he enjoyed it because he worked at 5 o'clock in the morning all week long. And his only day to actually wake me up in the morning was on Saturday morning. And so he would whip the door open, flip the light on, and loudly say, "Rise and shine." How many of your parents said something like that? Did you know there's a Bible verse for that? I wish I had known it when I was a teenager. Now, it may have not been well received if I quoted the Bible to them at that time in the morning, but Proverbs 27:14, and I'm going to give you the King James effect this morning because it's the full effect. It says, "He that blesseth his friend with a loud voice, rising early in the morning, it shall be counted as a curse to him." It's in the Bible. How many of you knew that? I mean, that is wisdom lit at its best. It's wisdom literature. We can use this as practical thing in our lives to be able to quote this verse. Now, some of you are going to go home and memorize that, aren't you? I wish I'd known that verse earlier in life. It was a wake-up call for sure for my dad. But there are many different types of wake-up calls that we receive throughout our lives. Another example of this would be like just over a year ago, I was mountain biking, and I went on an extra long ride. And towards the end of the ride, I started getting klutzy. And that means when you're mountain biking, it means you get a little tired, a little fatigued. You start cutting corners. And that's never a good thing when you're mountain biking because you're whipping through the woods 10, 15, 20 miles an hour. And you start rubbing your shoulder on trees. And you start scuffing your handlebars on trees. And sometimes you bounce off a tree just a little bit. And some of you are shaking your heads like, why do you do that? As you mountain bike, you get so familiar with your surroundings that you're just like an inch away from hitting that tree. And as you get more fatigued, as you get more tired, you actually start scuffing yourself against the tree. So I started doing that. I started realizing my body was saying, it's probably time to go ahead and cut this ride short. And then my mind said, well, I could do the real easy route. That's just around the corner. I'll just do this 1.5 mile loop. It's the easiest one in the park. You know there's a problem with that, right? My mind was like wanting to do more, but my body was saying no. I could tell that it was time to stop. But what happens on the easiest trip? You go faster. And that's exactly what I did. I went faster. It was the last 1.5 miles. And there was this hop in a trail where you catch it and you ramp, you jump up in the air. I got right up in the air with full confidence until I didn't have confidence. And there's that moment where you're like, uh-oh, I'm out of control, the bike's out of control, and I had to just jump off the bike. I had to drop off the bike and hit the trail and slide down the trail on my side and on my back, and I had a little bit of road rash, trail rash on my arm, a little bit of a bruise. But luckily, I didn't break anything. But I remember like checking, because I heard some cracking, and it was my helmet that cracked, and I hit a rock and some different things. And I remember checking to see if I had broken something, and then my body reminded me, yeah, that was a wake-up call. I told you not to go any further. And I went further anyway. How about this as parents, when we receive a wake-up call from our kids? This is not a funny kind of wake-up call, but it happens. Have you ever witnessed your kids having a bad attitude or doing something or saying something negative, and you go to correct them, but in the back of your mind, as you are correcting them, you remember that their attitude or their tone of voice sounds a little bit like you at a certain moment, right? Like it's a harsh wake-up call, and we're like, wait a second, don't do that. But I just did that a few weeks ago or a few months ago, and maybe, just maybe, you learned that attitude about this topic from me. It's a big wake-up call, and as a parent, I'm telling you that because I've experienced that myself. We've all experienced that, and that is another type of wake-up call. Some wake-up calls can be on the surface, like rise and shine, or the mountain biking thing. Fortunately, that was just a surface wake-up call. But others can be more personal and can hit at home. No matter what kind of wake-up calls you've received over time, we find in today's passage that Paul is giving the church the ultimate wake-up call, literally saying, wake up from your slumber. A new day is dawning. Well, Paul's first wake-up call to the church is love one another. And I love how he phrases it in this passage. Let no debt remain outstanding except the continuing debt to love one another. This idea of debt in context of earlier verses from Paul could be taken literally as pay off your debts. But Paul had something else in mind. He had already used this idea as debt as a metaphor several times in Romans. In chapter 1, he used it to bring the gospel to all people. It was his debt to bring the gospel to all people. Then later on in chapter 8, the Christian's obligation to live by the Spirit and not by the flesh. And we heard that reflected again in today's passage. This breathes life into this metaphor. Paul is not just adding another commandment. It's not just adding another rule to your life, like an admonition to submitting to government authorities, like he just mentioned right before this passage. But he's telling the church to rise and shine. He is commanding the church to love. This is a debt owed to everyone that can never be paid off. It can't be checked off. You can't say that you've been there and done that. You can't even buy the t-shirt for it, right? You can't, because it's something that God is calling us to do each and every day. Each and every day of our lives is different. And so God is calling us to rise to the occasion, to have enough level of empathy in our lives, to adjust and be flexible to the needs around us, and to rise to the occasion of loving one another. That's what this passage is all about. Now, this focus on love is not new. We've heard this a lot. And I think the reason why we hear it so much in the Bible, and then you hear it so much preached about, is because we're always trying to adjust and grow into this level of faith, this level of loving one another that God is calling us to. This focus on love was from 2,000 years ago. In early Christian communities, it was a revolutionary thought. And today, it's a revolutionary thought for us. You see, historically, Judaism cherished the command to love, but you didn't see it highlighted the same way that Jesus taught it in the Gospels. Paul reflects the passion of the teaching in today's passage. 2,000 years ago, the rest of the world had nothing in comparison to loving your neighbor, to the point where we know that Jesus says, love our enemies, love our neighbor, love the people that we don't get along with, love everyone. Christians were the example of Christ, and the teaching was an obvious response to the sacrifice that Jesus made for our lives. And today, we celebrate communion. As we remember communion, the sacrifice that Jesus Christ made for us, the body broken and the blood that is shed for us, it needs to inspire us all the more to love one another. This verse calls us back to check our identity as a church, and it tells us to wake up. A new day is dawning. And we see all around us the idea that love just magically happens, don't we? We see this on social media. We see it on TV. We see it in movies. We see it on YouTube. We are often idealistic about romantic love, and that can translate to how we feel about love in general. How many bachelorette, Love Island type of reality shows do we need for people to realize that love is so much more than this? Love is so much more than just a romantic idea. It's so much more than just a feeling. The love that Paul is talking about calls us to be attentive. It's a wake-up call for a deep reflection as a church about what authentic love means. We need to better understand what love means and what love doesn't mean. Since authentic love for one another in our church community is forever a debt, we have to realize that it always is a work in progress. Love goes beyond our differences. Love goes beyond our politics. Love goes beyond the way you vote. And guess what? Love goes beyond your theology. Because when you start getting into theological conversation, we can be on the spectrum all over with our theology. But there's one thing that remains true, and we don't argue about it, and that is God's love. That brings us together. That unites us. When we say we have an open table for communion, why is that? Because God's love is beyond us. We can't put stipulations on the table. We can't put stipulations on people coming in the door or not. We can't do that because God is calling us to love. It's not something we argue about. Puts us in the same spot, puts us in the same place. Paul is giving us a wake-up call to love one another. If there is any place that should be a safe place, it should be the church. And we need to provide that for people. So love one another, and that provides a safe place. Love your neighbor. Paul continues his wake-up call by giving examples of commandments, and then saying that all the commandments can be summed up with one. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love God with all of your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. Love fulfills the Old Testament law. We see Paul quoting Leviticus, of all things, 19:18. Go look that up sometime. Leviticus 19:18 says, love your neighbor as yourself. There are over 800 commandments and rules and laws in the Old Testament. Over 800. The 10 Commandments were one way to summarize those laws, but Jesus takes it to a whole new level by summarizing 800 laws in one commandment: to love God with all of your heart and to love your neighbor as yourself. We hear echoes of Jesus' teaching throughout Romans in chapters 12 and 13, and definitely in this passage. The idea of summarizing the commandments is one that we talked about last week, because in Judaism, what they do, they would make necklaces with sayings, and they would hang them around the sayings of the gospel would be close to their heart. This is another one that they would put around: love God with all of your heart. Love your neighbor as yourself. They would put it into their feet. They would wear it. They would wear it around their heart. They would be reminded of that love. When we jump to verse 10, the verse changes tone a little bit. From loving one's neighbor to love does no harm to a neighbor. This verse is a direct teaching, but not harming your neighbor is the entry point, right? It's the entry point, not the finish line. In other words, there is so much more to loving your neighbor than just doing no harm. Loving your neighbor is an active, intentional part and calling of our life. Not that loving your neighbor can earn you salvation. I don't want you to think that. Loving your neighbor is a natural response to God's love for you. It's an overflow. It's an outpouring of God's grace and love in your life so that it actually impacts others. Do you see how these things are tied together? Do not be motivated by guilt or shame. It does no good. It creates fear and anxiety in your life. Do not be motivated by guilt or shame to love one another or to love your neighbor. Instead, it's God's gift of grace that you experience this love, that you share with one another. And this love pours out into our community. True love does not spring from our emotions. Instead, it comes from the depth of our hearts, and it transforms our very will. Here's an example that you may relate to. If you try to love someone that you really dislike, then it can come across as hypocritical. But if you place yourself in their shoes, and if you try to live in their skin for them, love can happen over time. But it takes time. It takes hard work. It takes being intentional about praying for that person, about hearing them, listening to them, and hearing their perspective. And is it different than your perspective? Of course it is. That's why we need to listen. Because it creates a sympathy, even for persons that we dislike. If you think that God is going to wake you up one morning with a genuine love for a person that you dislike, without transformation in your own heart, you may as well believe in the tooth fairy. Seriously, I said that. I just said that, but really, if we are going to love, if we're going to love those around us, we have a genuine love for people that we even dislike, it means a transformation happens in our home. And you know when it happens, because you're surprised by it. You're like, wait a second. And you can think of the person, can't you, that you dislike? Like the things just come right to the surface. You have 10 arguments right away of why you dislike this person, why this person did wrong to you. It just builds up, doesn't it? That's part of the healing process. As we learn to forgive, as we learn to have a level of empathy, that we care for others, that we genuinely love our neighbor. When that happens, it helps us to listen, and then it helps us to respond appropriately. And you may start thinking, you know what? I have a genuine care for that person. I still don't get along with them. See, that's real. That's realistic. Okay? I still don't understand what makes them tick. But you know what? I want good for them. I genuinely want good for them. Where did that come from? That's a miracle. Because Jesus is working in your life. And because transformation is happening from the inside out. A new day is dawning. Paul is assuming that his readers understand what time it is. After all, they didn't have daylight savings time, right? Some of you showed up a little early for church today. But it's not a time or a date that can be established as much as it's a season that the church finds itself in. A world that is fragile and trying to figure out a way to cope. It's for such a time as this kind of season. Paul expects the church to understand that yesterday is fading into the night and that there is a new day on the horizon. Paul is expecting his readers to be ready before the new day dawns or before a new day fully breaks. This theme reminds the church and reminds us today of early Easter morning. They went to the tomb. The stone was rolled away. New life happened because of what Jesus did, rising from the dead. And this is a reminder from Paul to us that new life will happen, that a new day is dawning, that Jesus Christ is rising up within us to transform us, to change us. Paul gives us this wake-up call because our salvation is nearer now than it ever was. His motivation isn't to predict the return of Jesus Christ. He's urging Christians to act now in a way that is appropriate for when Christ returns. To be mission-minded people. To be intentional about loving our neighbors. Paul refers to the final day when God will make all things new in Christ. He's reminding the church that even though the passage of time seems to move on without much change, we should not forget God's call to the church, walking in the love of Jesus. It's important for us to know what time it is, that our world is a fragile world. Ever since the resurrection of Jesus, the world has been overlapped with the old day and the new day. There's a tension because both are existing at the same time. God is calling us to new life, and yet we're still not perfect. We're still in the process of transformation. We're still struggling. And so God is working on us. So there is this tension. We literally live in a time between the night and a new day dawning. So the mental, moral, emotional, and spiritual efforts must continue to look forward to that new day. To the point of seeing God at work around you in the most common ways. We sometimes want to look for a sign in the sky. But if our eyes are open, we can see that God is working in the most common ways in every day. So let me ask you, what does loving one another in a fragile world? What does loving our neighbor in a fragile world look like? What does it look like for the church to be awakened in this fragile world? New day is dawning. If we stop and listen, we'll see new ways to partner with our community, to meet needs right here in our neighborhood. We had our trunk or treat last week, and it was exciting. It's great to see our neighbors here. And on Monday and Tuesday, I was calling the people who had won. We gave out gift cards to some of our guests. And we gave out 6 different gift cards, so I called them Monday and Tuesday. And this is a God thing. When you call, people usually just let it go to voicemail, right? 4 out of the 6 answered the phone. I was shocked on the first one. I was like, okay, I need to adjust myself and get used to this. And I started talking to our neighbors. And also 4 out of 6 live within just a block or 2 from this church that one knows. Paul works at Home Depot. And Paul says, well, I'm just getting off work. Can I stop by now? I said, yeah. It's not on the door 3 minutes later. He meant now. And he just was with a grin, and it was a $10 gift card. He comes back. And Paul says, this is just so cool that you guys did this. Thank you for doing this. And thank you for the card. It was just this response, in this connection in a moment. Had over 100 kids walk through this sanctuary. We had some of our booths set up here in the sanctuary as well because it was raining outside. I have to say, when we work on our vision for the future, it won't be any one thing we do. So it won't be trunk or treat alone. It will be all the things that we do. We will need to be mission-focused as a church, flexible, grace-filled people, showing our love for all. The pandemic was bad in so many ways, but the silver lining is this. We have a reset button. And the pandemic actually gave us that reset. Because now we can ask, well, before we do that activity, what's the purpose? What's the mission? Should we? Can we use resources differently? Can we use resources more effectively to reach our neighbors? So with anything that we do, we need to ask why. Does it accomplish our mission? How do people in our community see this as more than a building? You see, I know that you see this as more than a building. I know because of how you treat one another. You love one another. You encourage one another. You're thoughtful to one another. So you've got this idea and this mission of showing God's love to one another and being a community of Christ. So we have to ask, how does that translate to our neighborhood? How does that translate? The love that you have here, how does it go beyond our walls? Now, speaking of wake-up calls, I have to say that today's sermon was full of wake-up calls. I actually planned preaching on this verse months ago and try to plan out in advance and pick verses and themes and things like that. Well, then Ron Kittle says, he's the chair of stewardship, and he says, hey, well, stewardship Sunday. We start trying to coordinate days, and today was the day that it landed best. I told him in the meeting, I said, I don't even know which verse I have picked out for that day. I don't know if it will complement. Listen to the first part of this verse. It's up on the screen. Let no debt remain outstanding, except the continuing debt to love one another. There's no better stewardship verse than that. Because the love that we have for one is the way that we respond from God's love to one another and to our neighbors. When we talk about stewardship commitments, we may talk about dollars when we say stewardship, but it's so much more than dollars. We have a mountain to climb. But if we utilize the resources that we currently have and the budget for more than just turning on the lights, and guess what? God will provide. An example of that provision, sermon was already done. Friday, I was on my way. Friday's my day off typically. And so I was on my way to Brown County. And I got an email from the United Methodist Foundation for Indiana. And we got a grant for $3,000. It's in the midst of all of these provisions. I mean, I was just blown away. We wrote this grant, the council looked it over and checked it out and helped me with writing this grant, and we turned it in. This is probably 2 months ago. $3,000. It's put one foot in front of the other, and God will provide. And so what does that look like when you're climbing the mountain? That may be a prayer. That may be turning in your stewardship commitment. That may be forgiving someone. That may be taking a moment to say something nice to someone, to go out of your way, to love one another, to love your neighbor. It's definitely time for us to be able to show love and to respond. Okay? A stewardship commitment from you helps us to plan our budgets, helps us to be responsible stewards with how God provides. But there is nothing more powerful than you sharing the love of God